What is going on, everyone? In this one, we are tackling a popular Fallout 4 mystery. Is the sole survivor a synth? In my investigation for this one, I found that this mystery is very unique compared to a lot of the other mysteries I've covered. The sole survivor being a synth and not being a synth are two contradictory things, but a lot of the evidence just isn't presented to us like that. More specifically, I found a lot of double standards when I was looking for reasons to believe that the sole survivor is human. So let's begin by discussing those. The first thing I've got for you is that Codsworth and Lookout both recognize the sole survivor as Nate or Nora, depending on which one you chose. And since they're robots, it seems hard to believe that they could be mistaken. However, the Institute is very good at what it does. Consider what Hancock says about the synth replica of his brother.
When I'd first heard the rumors he'd been swapped for a synth, thinking back on that night, I thought it made a lot of sense. But now, I don't know. I don't think I buy it. I've seen him since then, and there's no way they copied him that perfectly. Even got his tight-ass walk.
Hence, I think it's reasonable to assume that synth replacements are so good that they can fool even robots. Next up, we've got the safe test. To enter the settlement of Covenant, one must take the safe test, which, as we find out during the quest Human Error, is actually testing whether or not the subject is a synth. The test is still in its infancy, but Dr. Chambers has discovered a pattern with question 4. The question is, congratulations, you made it onto a baseball team. Which position do you prefer? And synths tend to answer catcher. I have two guesses as to why this could be the case. First, the safe test is modeled after the GOAT from Fallout 3, which is a career aptitude test, and most synths that are masquerading as humans were made with a similar purpose in mind, that being some sort of Institute grunt work. So with that in mind, it seems likely that they'd answer career aptitude questions in a similar way. Second, the vast majority of synths that happen by Covenant are probably synths that the Railroad helped escape, so this could be the result of some baseline memory that Dr. Amari uses having to do with baseball. But what we're interested in is what happens when the sole survivor takes the test. No matter how they answer, the result is always the same. Swanson opens the gate for them. Some might suggest that Bethesda is hinting that the sole survivor is not a synth by making it impossible for them to fail the test, since even if they do answer question 4 with catcher, Swanson dubs them as a false positive and lets them in. However, that's flawed, because why assume that they did indeed pass the test? The procedure for failures is that the guards wait for an opportunity to capture the subject, then they strike. So I think it would be short-sighted of us to assume that they passed the test just because Swanson doesn't call them out if they answer catcher, since they could just be waiting for an ideal time to apprehend the sole survivor. And in the event that the player does side with them, they may just be deciding that it's more beneficial to have them as an ally. So in summary, it doesn't seem like the safe test is really of any help to us in figuring out if the sole survivor is a synth. Now let's talk about the sole survivor's memories. Throughout the game, there are numerous occasions in which the sole survivor recalls things from their life before waking up in Vault 111. A few examples are being familiar with the name Eddie Winter, recalling Nuka World, knowing the Vault Tech rep, recalling commercials for Grey Garden, and most importantly, knowing things about his or herself, such as knowing that they are part of a young military family consisting of a wife, husband, and son. The things that would have been big news in 2077 would be easy for the Institute to find and embed in a synth, but the Vault Tech rep and family situation would be much harder. However, not impossible. There are ways that the Institute could have gotten that information. In fact, even if these are Nate or Nora's real memories, the sole survivor could still be a synth, and here's how. Nick Valentine's life story establishes that the Institute is capable of copying a real person's mind and placing it into a synth. So perhaps the sole survivor was imbued with Nate or Nora's mind. There is a flaw here though. This seemingly assumes that they did survive the cryogenic stasis, which we aren't really certain of. However, perhaps they did not actually need to be alive for this mind transfer to work. A common concept in sci-fi when it comes to cryo is preserving brains, and knowing Bethesda, that's exactly the kind of thing that they might home in on. I mean, look at Robo-Brains and think about characters like Professor Calvert. So even if the cryopods didn't manage to keep Nate and Nora alive, they may have still kept their brains intact enough for the Institute to copy them. So in summary here, even if these memories are real, the sole survivor could still be a synth. Next up, we've got Dr. Amari. Some fans argue that she would have known if the sole survivor was a synth from a reading or something that she would have seen during Dangerous Minds. However, I just can't get behind that because we don't really know how these pods work. Throughout the game, we see that she can do a variety of things with them beyond their intended use, some of which do involve synths. But if there were some way for her to tell that the subject was a synth, I'm inclined to think that she would have been pretty freaked out to see that the sole survivor was one, because he or she definitely is not a railroad synth, which I'll further explain later. If the sole survivor is a synth, they are an institute synth. So if Amari found out that the sole survivor was a synth while they were in Kellogg's mind, she'd assume that they were an institute spy and probably make sure that they never leave the memory lounger. Also, Dima says that the only way to be sure is to do an autopsy, and he is familiar with tech that's very similar to the memory loungers. He admits that he does not know if the sole survivor is a synth, yet he still sends them to retrieve his memories with the neural interface device. So he's confident that this will work regardless of whether they are human or synth. Hence, Gen-free sims seem to be so good that even these neural interface devices can't tell the difference between them and humans. Now here's the biggest issue with the sole survivor being a synth: Kellogg's memories of kidnapping Sean from Vault 111. His recollection of these events is consistent with the story that Father tells us. They unfroze everyone, took Sean and killed the sole survivor's spouse, called the sole survivor the backup, then refroze them. Also, Kellogg says that his boss left alive the one person that he shouldn't have, which pretty clearly seems to be the sole survivor. And when the sole survivor wakes up, they find that the whole scene is consistent with that narrative. This all seems to destroy any possibility that the sole survivor is a synth. However, it does not. There is one way that the sole survivor can still be a synth despite the contents of Kellogg's memories, and this is the theory that I believe to be true. This took me a long time to piece together, but it was worth it, because now I have quite a story to tell you. To begin, here's what I think really took place in Vault 111 after the residents of Sanctuary Hills were frozen. The Overseer's terminal tells us that this vault's purpose is to test the long-term effects of suspended animation on unaware human subjects. And apparently, sometime during the isolation period, there was an incident with Pod C3. The subject in that pod almost fought out, and the scientists only noticed because he was having heart palpitations. Furthermore, the Overseer's terminal makes a few more references to cardiopulmonary function, so clearly this was a key point of interest in their research about cryogenics. More terminal entries reveal that after the isolation period was over, the non-scientists among the staff wanted to leave, but the Overseer wouldn't allow it. Then a coup formed, and based on the final entries, the scattered placement of the bodies, and the fact that there are only 5 bodies, this coup seems to have been successful. A large portion of the staff left Vault 111, and they appear to have killed anyone that stood against them. So, the residents in the cryopods were left abandoned. And my theory is that over time, all of the cryopods began having this issue that Pod C3 had, and with no one there to fix it, it eventually killed all of the residents. Well, except for one, Sean. One thing that constantly comes up after meeting him as Father is how being an infant made him the perfect subject. And I think that's a hint for how he survived Vault 111. He was a perfect subject for the cryo experiments too. Look at the other residents, they still have ice on them, so whatever's going on with the pods hasn't completely unfrozen them. But it has thawed them out enough to kill them due to some medical complications stemming from heart palpitations. However, Sean was an infant when he was frozen, so I think the idea here is that he was just small enough that his pod was able to keep him in cryogenic stasis, despite whatever issue killed the adults. It was still cold enough to keep his little body frozen, at least until Kellogg took him. However, everyone else in the cryopods died long before Kellogg got there, including Nora and Nate. Furthermore, there's another hint for this in the vault, the cryolator. In the Overseer's entry about the cryolator, he describes it as just a portable cryo device. He doesn't seem to be trying to make a weapon at all. Yet, what does the cryolator do? It kills. Which I think is also the story with the pods. They were intended to for long life, but in reality they killed most of the subjects. So yeah, I think that the cryolator is a hint for what the pods actually did to the residents. So that's what I believe really took place in Vault 111 between the residents being frozen and Kellogg showing up. Now let's pick up where we left off with Sean. Just like he tells us, the Institute took him because he was the perfect sample for their research on synthetic organics, and his DNA became the building blocks of all the Gen-free Sims. He was not a prisoner. He grew up and studied science just like everyone else in the Institute. In fact, he eventually ascended to director and adopted the moniker Father because he is like a father to the Sims. Father was a great director for many years, then one day he found out that he was sick. All we know about his illness is that it's an aggressive form of cancer. The Institute's doctors have treated him, and that may have given him a few extra months, but apparently they simply cannot save him. So Father found out that he was going to die, and as people often do when they receive that news, he reflected on his life. And there are a few things that came up in this reflection that we need to discuss. First, I think he had a change of heart regarding Sims. Perhaps he always had doubts about the Institute's philosophy towards Sims, or maybe something Alan Benet said got him thinking. Regardless, finding out that he was dying prompted him to figure out exactly what he thought about Sims. Are they sentient? Is the Institute's use and treatment of them ethical, etc.? So what did he decide? Well, listen to this holotape that he gives the sole survivor if they side with the Institute.
If you are hearing this, then the time has come. I am gone. I can no longer look after young Sean. I hope that you might be willing. He has been reprogrammed to believe he is your son. I hope that was not too presumptuous on my part. Both he and you deserve a chance to be a family. Please, take care of him.
Now, do those sound like the words of a person that believes Sims are simply machines and nothing more? No. So he may not have believed that Sims were as sentient as humans, but he definitely thought that they were more than machines. In regards to the ethics of creating them and using them, my guess there is that he decided that the existence the Institute gives them is better than no existence at all. Pay close attention to this dialogue.
If the synths are intelligent and self-aware, then they have a right to free will.
However closely they may approximate human behavior, they are still our creations. When you see what I have to show you, I think you'll agree that we know what is best for our synths.
More than anything, he comes across as a concerned parent. To him, Sims are like his children, so he doesn't take kindly to the railroad corrupting their minds and helping them leave the safe institute for the dangerous wasteland. So in summary here, Father seems to believe that Sims have some level of personhood, and existing under the supervision of the institute is what is best for them. To him, it's not a question of them being the institute's property, he's just doing what he thinks is best for his kids. Though he seems to keep these thoughts to himself because he knows that this is not a popular opinion among his peers. So he found out that he was going to die and had this change of heart about Sims, but that's not the only thing he reflected on. He also had to think about the future of the Institute. The timing of his illness was awful because he was on the verge of achieving some big goals, such as finalizing the nuclear reactor, eliminating threats to the Institute, and establishing an understanding with the people of the Commonwealth. His death would put all of those things in jeopardy, and there was no candidate to replace him that was both a great leader and shared his vision for the future. So, Father hatched a grand scheme to safeguard his vision for the Institute's future beyond his death. He needed a perfect successor, someone with natural leadership traits that shared his ideology regarding Sims, that would do what is necessary to protect the Institute from external threats, and someone that both the inhabitants of the Institute and the wastelanders of the outside world would respect and revere. However, there simply was no such candidate within the Institute, so he had to look outside, which made his already difficult search much harder. Now, in addition to the qualifications I just listed, this candidate also needed to be an outsider that the Institute would somehow, some way accept into their society and eventually come to accept as their director. How could such a person possibly exist? Father was at his wit's end, but then it occurred to him, wait, I came from outside and these people eventually came to accept me as their leader. So, the most logical place to look was where he came from, Vault 111. It's not clear how much he knew about what actually happens there before this, but it seems to be common knowledge among the Institute that he came from there. Though knowing how the Institute operates, these sorts of operations tends to be on a need-to-know basis. So whoever the director was at the time was probably transparent about Sean because they knew that people would have questions about where he came from. But further details, like that everyone else in the vault was dead, probably were never disclosed. Which suited Father's needs perfectly because now he could simply make the perfect candidate to replace him. Yes, that's right. I believe that Father created a synth replica of one of his parents and set them on a course to infiltrate the Institute and in the process become the perfect candidate to succeed him. And that, of course, is the sole survivor. Think about it. He openly admits that it's no coincidence that the sole survivor's path crossed Kellogg's path and that he released them from the cryopod. This confirms that he has been pulling some strings to guide the sole survivor from the shadows since they left the vault. So Father has been the stage master all along. Replacing one of his parents was brilliant because the biggest challenge he faced was how to justify letting this outsider into the Institute to his people. And this is the perfect solution to that problem, because who would question him taking an interest in his parents? Surely everyone would understand that if one of his parents were to kill Kellogg and successfully infiltrate the Institute, the most sensible thing to do would be to welcome them aboard and offer them Kellogg's job. So Father created the sole survivor, and to prevent them from realizing that they are a synth, he embedded some new memories to explain what happened to Sean and how everyone else in the vault died. Also, he altered some of the terminal entries to make them consistent with the new memories. However, it wasn't that simple. He still needed to make sure that the sole survivor was an accurate replica in order to ensure that they never find out that they are a synth. Because who knows what records of Nate and Nora could be out there somewhere. Also, what if they were to run into a pre-war ghoul that knew Nate and Nora? So Father had to produce an accurate replica to account for situations like that. Perhaps he did copy Nate or Nora's mind into a synth like we discussed earlier. But there is another way that he could have gotten a lot of information about his family to produce this replica. Codsworth was living in Sanctuary by himself for over 200 years, and eventually the caravanners that we are familiar with from the game started coming by. And we know from the SRB terminal that all of the caravanners are Institute informants. So maybe when they visited Sanctuary, they would talk to Codsworth about his family. Also, if he were distracted, Sims could easily sneak into the House of Tomorrow to investigate. They would find things like Nora's law degree, Nate's uniform, their holotapes, and various records about the family. With all that and whatever information Vault-Tec had on them, Sims could easily find more records in Nora's old school, the county court archives, military facilities, etc. So, with that in mind, let's examine the House of Tomorrow before and after the bombs fell. The big thing that jumps out at me is that Nate's uniform, Nora's law degree, and the family holotapes are all missing after the bombs fell. One could easily argue that scrappers could have taken that stuff, but why leave things like the Grognak comic? And most of all, why not snatch Codsworth? I mean, robots are scrapper gold. So where did this stuff go? Well, I think that Father Sims took it to gather more intel about his family. Also, a very important thing to note is that Father could have gotten his parents' voices from the holotapes. Some of them could be personal recordings. So everything's going well for Father so far. However, there must have been some people that knew the truth about Vault 111. Well, yes, the executives at the time of the operation probably knew, but to be high-ranking, they couldn't have been very young. And according to Father, that was 60 years ago. So they were likely all deceased by the time Father started making all these plans. Though one person that does come to mind who might have known the truth is Dr. Zimmer. So perhaps that's exactly why Father is keeping Dr. Zimmer far away from the Institute on this hush-hush mission. Because if he were around, he'd spill the beans about the residents of Vault 111, thus blowing the sole survivor's cover and ruining Father's plan. Or maybe the Lone Wanderer did kill Zimmer, but the Institute hasn't given up hope that he's alive. It doesn't really matter for our purposes, just thought I'd throw it in because it's an interesting thought. Regardless, Father still had one loose end to tie up, Kellogg. Like I said before, the biggest issue with the sole survivor being a synth is that Kellogg's memories are consistent with the story that Father tells us, but that can be reconciled with this theory. In fact, I'd go so far as to say it improves this theory, and here's why. Those of you that have seen my video about the broken mask incident might remember me talking about a holotape called Implant Update Session number 7. It's hidden in sublevel 21D of the Institute, and it's a recording of one of Kellogg's neural implants being replaced. It doesn't seem to serve any purpose beyond being a cool little thing you can find in the world like an Easter egg, essentially. However, I believe that there is hidden meaning here. I used this tape a little bit in the video about the broken mask incident, but since then I always thought this can't be its only purpose. The dialogue is too precise to just be a glimpse of how Mr. Carter worked, and now I think I figured out its main purpose. I believe Implant Update Session number 7 is one of the key clues to solving this mystery, and here's why. This tape establishes that these implants are replaced every once in a while, so the ones Kellogg had in Vault 111 aren't necessarily the ones that we find on his corpse in Fort Hagen. So what am I getting at here? Well, I think that during one of these update sessions, Father tampered with Kellogg's memories of the events that took place in Vault 111 to match what he wanted the sole survivor to believe happened, so that when they eventually found a way to access Kellogg's memories, which remember was always part of Father's plan, they wouldn't find out that they are a synth. I mean, we know that the Institute can upload human memories into synths, so I feel safe assuming that they are capable of altering Kellogg's memories as well. I think if they can do that, they can do this as well. Also, pay close attention to what Kellogg says here.
Now this next part is especially delicate, so if you could please look straight into the light. Should everything be purple?
And what color are these little nerves that we see in Kellogg's memory banks? Purple. So I think the purpose of Implant Update Session number 7 is to draw our gaze to the connection between these implants and what we're seeing in his minds during Dangerous Minds. What we're seeing here isn't a reliable narrative, it's a story that's been laid out for us by Father for his own purposes. I mean, during Dangerous Minds, Kellogg even notes that it didn't make any sense to let the other Vault Dwellers die. Surely the Institute would have some use for them, even if the baby is the best subject, the more subjects the better. All of these people were alive before the bombs fell, so they would all be useful in researching pre-war DNA. And even if the Institute didn't want them for some reason, why even unfreeze them? So what is the explanation here? Well, this isn't really what happened. Everyone except for Sean was dead when Kellogg got there, and Father needed to make sense of that weird detail in the narrative that he wanted Kellogg and the sole survivor to believe. If he were to let the sole survivor believe what really happened to the others, that their pods failed over time, that would prompt them to ask, wait, if that's what happened to all of them, then why didn't my pod ever malfunction? So, Father tweaked Kellogg and the sole survivors' accounts of what happened to lead them to believe that the Institute killed the other Vault Dwellers and that the sole survivor was a backup test subject in order to explain why everyone except for them died. Another thing that doesn't make sense is why did these two scientists accompany Kellogg? What really needs to happen here? He needs to open a terminal, open a pod, and take a baby. So I don't think that anyone actually did accompany Kellogg. I think Father just put these two people here so that Kellogg has someone to have dialogue with so that the sole survivor can hear Kellogg's name and get some information. And perhaps the weirdest detail of them all, why kill the spouse? I mean, if the parents are the best backup test subjects, then why not leave both of them alive and have two backups? Kellogg is an experienced merc, surely he's capable of just forcing them back into the pod without shooting them. So you know the drill, this isn't really what happens, but why does Father want the sole survivor and Kellogg to believe that it is? Well, my guess here is that it's to make the sole survivor extra vengeful towards Kellogg so that they will hunt him down and kill him in a way that's brutal enough for them to discover the implants, which of course plays a key role in the sole survivor infiltrating the Institute, which is exactly what Father wants. Now let's talk more about the sole survivor's journey to the Institute. Like I said, I think Father has laid a lot of this out for them, perhaps not every last detail, but he made sure that everyone and everything they would need to infiltrate the Institute was out there somewhere in the Commonwealth. First, isn't it awfully convenient that along the road to anywhere that the sole survivor might go after leaving the vault, there just happens to be a trained German Shepherd? And that this dog makes finding Kellogg a whole lot easier? This, in my opinion, is way too convenient. Dog meat is definitely a synth, which I may cover in a separate video. So first, Father makes sure that you get dog meat, and then he just figures that anyone that you ask for help is going to send you to Diamond City, which they do. And that works out great because in Diamond City there just happens to be a detective that specializes in missing persons cases. And of course, as Kellogg puts it, it's pretty clear that Father had him stationed in Diamond City with the child Synth so that the sole survivor and Nick Valentine would have a trail to follow. Then, very conveniently, they just happen to have Dogmeat who can track the scent of Kellogg's cigars. And if Dogmeat is not your current companion, somehow he just knows to wait for you outside the house. So Dogmeat takes you to Kellogg, you kill him and discover that he's a cyborg. And what a coincidence that the detective you met along the way just happens to have a contact that can help you get data off of his brain, and that he just happens to be the key component in doing that. Does Father know that Dr. Amari is the person that performs mind wipes for the railroad? Maybe. But even if he did, I think he saw that as a problem for another day. So in Kellogg's memories, the sole survivor sees what Father wants them to see. And I think this applies to more than just Virgil and what happened in the vault. In the other memories, we find out that Kellogg's life story is very similar to the sole survivor's. So how is this relevant? Well, I think that Father wants the sole survivor to learn a lesson in empathy. Remember, his goal is for the sole survivor to become the perfect leader for the Institute, and good leaders need to be very understanding. So showing the sole survivor that their greatest enemy went through some very similar things to them is a very fitting way to teach them that everyone has reasons for being who they are. This also raises the question, did any of this really happen to Kellogg? Maybe Father just made all of this up and implanted these memories. I'm not sure about that one, but keep in mind that the Institute can transmit real human memories into their AI, so it could be a combination of both for all we know. So from the memories, the sole survivor finds out about Virgil, and he provides the blueprints for the teleporter. Of course, Virgil is a traitor, but just like I said for Amari, I'm thinking that Father saw that as a problem for another day. And from there, all the sole survivor needed to do was bring down a courser and find someone to help build the teleporter. Here, Justin Ao asks the sole survivor how they were able to bring down the courser. Well, it makes a lot of sense with our theory, doesn't it? If the sole survivor is a synth created by Father, then maybe he did some tampering to increase their combat efficiency. Now all the sole survivor needed to do is build the teleporter, and as it turns out, there are a few individuals in the Commonwealth who can do this. So once that's done, the sole survivor is able to infiltrate the Institute, exactly as Father planned. Also, throughout the sole survivor's adventures in the Commonwealth, they become very well connected and earn a lot of trust with the wasteland inhabitants, which is perfect for another one of Father's goals, bridging the gap between the Institute and the outside world. So yeah, given how conveniently the sole survivor's path to the Institute is laid out and how much siding with the Institute benefits Father, if the sole survivor is a synth, I am very confident that this is the story behind it. It's part of Father's scheme to safeguard the Institute's future after he passes. However, there's a big flaw here. The player does not have to side with the Institute, but that can be reconciled with the simple explanation that Father's plan did not work. Or if you want to get a bit more artistically ironic, perhaps making the sole survivor the perfect leader backfired because they gained the perspective to see that the Institute is evil. One line of dialogue that's been sticking with me throughout working on this video is this line of Dima's.
Data is easy to migrate, but feelings, that's a hard thing to transfer into another mind.
Assuming that the theory I just presented to you is correct, this is the perfect explanation for the varying choices that we can make throughout playing Fallout 4. Father simply couldn't account for the sole survivor's autonomy, which is a very common theme in AI-based sci-fi. Consider some of the synths that deviate from what the Institute wants for them. Many of them wish to escape, and some do. Also, think about Gabriel. When synths don't know that they are synths, they become very unpredictable. Hence, even if the player chooses not to side with the Institute, they could still be a synth. Another issue with this theory is why doesn't Father simply copy his own mind into a synth to be a successor? Well, let's say he did that. For the sake of time, I won't explain every scenario to you, but I don't see a way around the copy eventually finding out that they're a synth. Through their interactions with Father, they would start to notice the similarities and eventually they would just figure it out. Which would be very risky because then they would have the Blade Runner problem. It's far easier for this whole scheme to be kept a secret if the successor doesn't know that they are a synth, because how could someone else find out if they don't know? So simply making a copy of himself just wouldn't work out. So if the sole survivor is a synth, that's how. It's part of an elaborate scheme of Father's to ensure that the Institute sticks to his vision for the future beyond his death. And that's the theory that I believe to be true. I mean, consider how he so readily names the sole survivor the next director when he barely knows them. And afterward, he even says, "I hope that was not presumptuous of me." Well, it certainly wasn't, because it's exactly what he created the sole survivor to do. This isn't something he did on a whim, it's something he's been planning for a long time. Also, in the events that the player does choose to side with the Institute for the main quest, thus completing Nuclear Family, they can find an orange division head coat in the director's quarters, which clearly implies that this is meant as the sole survivor's new director uniform. Orange is the color of the robotics division, and thus is also the color worn by most synths. I'm pretty confident that this is a hint that the sole survivor is a synth, and that them becoming director is a gradual step towards the Institute's attitude towards synths changing for the better, which remember seems to be one of Father's goals for the future. Furthermore, there are more reasons beyond this theory to believe that the sole survivor is a synth, so let's talk about those. One big thing that fans often point to is this dialogue with Dima. When asked about in their earliest memory, the sole survivor describes the day the bombs fell, which happened when they were already several decades old. Dima points out how suspicious that is. I mean, no memories of childhood? Just suddenly coming into existence as a married adult with a baby? This has Synth written all over it. However, this is a double standard. The Institute isn't sloppy, they are very thorough. Every synth they have out in the Commonwealth has a backstory, and the ones that are replacements for real people are extremely accurate replicas, both in appearance and behavior, so it's unlikely that Father would have been this careless. He would make sure to give the sole survivor some memories from before the day the bombs fell. So this lapse in memory could be explained by the sole survivor being a human and having lost big parts of their memory from trauma they've experienced out in the wasteland, or perhaps side effects from the cryopod. However, that's also a double standard because Sims can experience trauma as well. So ultimately, this dialogue with Dima doesn't help us. I think that really Bethesda put this in here to prompt us to ask the question for ourselves and get the theory train rolling. Another thing to consider is the Nuka World DLC. This expansion gives the player a chance to become the leader of a collective of raiders. So how is this relevant? Well, it's very reminiscent of Gabriel, the escaped synth that Father sends the sole survivor and X688 to retrieve from Libertalia. If the sole survivor is indeed a synth, then it seems very poetic that in the game's last canonical DLC they end up just like Gabriel, a rogue synth wreaking havoc without Institute supervision. However, with this we have the choice issue again, because at any point the player can choose to go the open season route and simply massacre all of the raiders. But even if you want to go that route, the sole survivor still needs to become the overboss of the raiders first. Furthermore, there's more to be said about Gabriel and Libertalia that really makes me think that we are meant to connect what happened here to Nuka World. The terminal entries at Libertalia reveal that the original people that became the raider gang here started out as Minutemen. Once the castle fell and the various detachments of Minutemen went their separate ways, this group made their home at Libertalia. And in their struggle to survive, they had to resort to becoming more and more brutal until they were simply raiders. Now consider the sole survivor's path to Nuka World. Bethesda makes sure to steer us into the Minutemen very early on in the journey. And after many adventures in the Commonwealth, the sole survivor eventually travels to Nuka World and is forced into the role of overboss of the raiders. So the sole survivor's path to Nuka World has a lot of parallels to everything that happened at Libertalia. And even if the player does choose to complete open season, one could argue that that's a parallel to the sole survivor and X688 clearing out Libertalia to capture Gabriel. Hence, I am convinced that these connections between Libertalia and Nuka World are intentional. Bethesda is using these parallels between Nuka World and Libertalia to hint that the sole survivor is a synth, like Gabriel. Next, there's an entry in Alan Benet's terminal that I would like to discuss. Apparently, every Gen 3 synth loves Fancy Lad snack cakes, and he can't figure out why. And look at this entry in the maintenance terminal in Vault 111. Another reference to Fancy Lad snack cakes. So this doesn't add much to our theory, but maybe this is meant to get us to connect Gen 3 Sims to Vault 111 and thus the sole survivor. I kept dwelling on these Fancy Lad snack cakes, and honestly I'm not sure what to make of it, so if you have any ideas please comment. Now let's talk more about the name Sole Survivor. The player character being named this seemingly implies that they are the only survivor of Vault 111. However, assuming that Father is telling us the truth, that makes two survivors, doesn't it? The player character and Sean. So, I think that the name Sole Survivor is two-pronged. It's both a misdirect and a hint. On the surface, it seems like it means that the player character is the one survivor of Vault 111, which is the misdirect. But it's also a hint to us that there is only one survivor, which is Sean. And since Sean made the player character, it's fitting that this makes them sort of a junior. Really, Sean is the sole survivor, and the player character is Sole Survivor Jr. Next up, we're going to take another look at Sean's kidnapping. Observe how Nate falls here. Now let's take a look at his body after the sole survivor is freed. He isn't quite in the same position that he fell in, is he? If we hold these two shots up side by side, we can see that it's a little bit off. And it's the same with Nora. So, it seems that Father got this detail a little bit wrong in the implanted memories. Some of you may be thinking, alright, nice theory, but how do we really know that Father isn't simply telling us the truth? Is there any golden reason to believe that this theory is true and Father's story is false? Well, yes folks, there is. Here's the last thing I've got for you. One popular mechanic in Fallout games is the Vault-Tec Assisted Targeting System, or VATS for short. The sole survivor can start using VATS as soon as they pick up the pistol in Vault 111. However, have you noticed something amiss here? The sole survivor has not yet obtained the Pip-Boy, yet we're using VATS? In all fairness, there are some fans that question whether or not VATS actually comes from Pip-Boys. Also, if the sole survivor is Nate, then one could argue that it's something from his military background that's allowing him to do this. But of course, that doesn't work for Nora. Some also argue that Bethesda may simply have not bothered to make the player wait for VATS because they saw this as a minor issue. However, I disagree. This would be a pretty simple sequence, and they did this with the wait mechanic. The player cannot wait until they leave Vault 111. Hence, I believe that Bethesda has purposefully allowed for the player to use VATS prior to getting the Pip-Boy. So how does the sole survivor do this? Well, it would make a lot of sense if the sole survivor were a synth and they were simply using their built-in targeting software. There's a terminal entry in the robotics lab that references this software, along with a recent update. Also, there's a cut terminal entry that we must read called Unique Project. Overriding directive to not alter our sim's basic functioning notwithstanding, Father has granted clearance for a rather unique project. In select gen-free units, the synthetic brain is indeed capable of accepting specific enhancements to the visual cortex, basal ganglia, and right parietal cortex. The result is substantially improved combat effectiveness, due to two factors. One, an increased understanding of weapon accuracy, to the extent that the combatants can actually visualize the percentage of effectively hitting targets, or smaller areas on those targets. 2, an altered sense of perception that mimics the effect of slowing or even stopping time. Recommend we commence surgery and field trials on appropriate operatives in the near future. Clearly what's being talked about here is an Institute equivalent of VATS. So how can the sole survivor use VATS without a Pip-Boy? Because they are a synth. Of course, we always have to be careful when it comes to cut content. But in this case, I think the reason that it was cut is because it's way too obvious of a clue. Especially given that there's another entry in the game that references the subject. So that's a wrap for this one, folks. That's why I believe the sole survivor is a synth. Also, I want to take a second to tell you guys about Fallout for Hope. Fallout for Hope is a charity initiative that raises money through Fallout-themed content for various causes, such as St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, the American Heart Association, the Alzheimer's Association, and more. Fallout for Hope does terrific work that helps a lot of people, so if you're interested in getting involved, supporting a campaign, or simply finding out more, see the link in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed this video, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and share this with your friends. Do you believe that the sole survivor is a synth? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks again, fellas, and I'll see you next time.